Hey everybody, in today's video I'm going to pass on some tips about how to avoid shake blur and motion blur in your images. Hey David, I just got my first roll of film back from my photo lab and a whole bunch of the images looked like they were shaky or blurry, or part of the subject was in focus and then there was this ghost coming off of them. What's going on and how do I avoid that? What you're describing sounds like motion-related blur. So let's see how that happens. So you've got your subject here. He's got a disproportionately large head to his body size and really tiny arms, but you know, that's how I draw stick people. So you're going to take a picture of him over here. So what's happening when you get motion blur is that your shutter speed is too slow. So let's say that you're using a 50mm lens, a standard lens. If you're hand holding your camera at 1/60th of a second and faster, meaning 1/125th, 1/1000th, you should be A-okay as long as you have a good grip and a good stance. Let's say you're using a 500mm lens at 1/60th of a second, you will probably get motion blur. So what's happening is when you take the picture, your lens is moving around a little bit more than you can hold it steady for that time period, and your subject is in focus here, but gets all of these like ghostly trails coming off of them from the motion blur. Okay, that's what's happening. So how do you prevent motion blur? There are two ways to prevent motion blur. One is to increase your shutter speed. Now, an easy rule to remember is that whatever your lens focal length is, you can probably hand hold it to a shutter speed that is the same as your focal length. So if you have a 50mm lens and a typical camera, typical 35mm film camera that has a 1/60th of a second shutter speed, it's advisable not to hand hold your camera for longer than that shutter speed with a 50mm lens. Even if you have a 28mm lens, don't go down to a 30th of a second because that's a long time to hand hold a camera steady without getting blur. Generally, a 60th of a second is about the slowest you can really hand hold a camera unless you're bracing yourself pretty well. So what if you have that 500mm lens on the front of your camera? That means you shouldn't hand hold your camera with a shutter speed slower than 1/500th of a second. At 1/250th, 1/125th, certainly 1/60th, you're going to be getting motion blur. So whatever your focal length is, don't go to a slower shutter speed than that same number. But what if you have to? What if you're taking a sunset photo and it needs a 2-second exposure, for instance, or an after dark photo that needs a 30-second exposure? The other thing you can do is get a tripod to hold your camera steady, and that gives you a much longer camera steady time. These videos have all been filmed on a tripod that's stationary, and as far as I know, none of them have any camera shake. So a good tripod will allow you to use that 500mm lens for a portrait or for a longer exposure. Likewise, if you're taking a 3-second exposure in the evening with a 50mm lens, the tripod will allow you to do that. Monopods can buy you about a stop of added shake reduction, but really if you want to have shake-free images, a tripod is the best way to go if you can't keep your shutter speed faster than your lens's focal length.